Imagine you were trudging through a waist-deep snowbank in the middle of a blizzard, miles from the nearest road, when you realize that every time you stop to catch your breath, the sound of crunching snow behind you stops exactly 1 second later. You turn around, and in the swirling whiteout, you see a pair of tracks following yours, but they aren't human, and they aren't paws. They look like the impressions of elongated, skeletal hands dragging through the frost. You start to run, but then you hear a voice whispering from the wind right next to your ear. It's your own voice, sounding ragged and frozen, saying, "Please, just let me in. It's so cold out here, even though your mouth hasn't moved a muscle." If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of thermal socks and soak them in ice water right before they head out for an overnight winter camping trip. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the desolate, frozen tundra of northern Ontario, a place where the winter sun is a rare guest and the wind carries a bite that can freeze exposed skin in seconds. Our main character is a man named Thomas. Thomas was a veteran surveyor, a man who spent his life measuring the edges of the map where the trees get thin and the rocks get sharp. He was used to the isolation, used to the way the cold makes your brain play tricks on you. But in January of 2015, Thomas encountered something in the snow that no amount of logic could explain. Thomas was working a solo contract, marking boundaries for a new mining claim. He had a small cabin as his base, but he often spent nights in a high-tech, four-season tent when he was too far out to trek back. On the third night of a massive cold front, the forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence, the kind of quiet that feels like the world has stopped breathing just to watch you. Thomas was settling into his sleeping bag when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching on the outside of the tent. It wasn't the sound of wind-blown branches. It was the sound of long, sharp fingernails dragging slowly across the nylon. He sat bolt upright, his breath misting in the freezing air. He grabbed his bear spray and a high-lumen flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He flicked the light on and pointed it at the tent wall. On the other side of the thin material, he saw the silhouette of a hand. But it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were nearly a foot long, with joints that seemed to bend in directions that made Thomas's stomach churn. "Who's there?" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. The scratching stopped. Then, from the darkness outside, came a response. It was Thomas's own voice, but it sounded wet, as if the speaker had a throat full of slush. "It's just me, Thomas. I forgot the keys. Open up." Thomas froze. He lived alone. He was 60 miles from the nearest human being. He clutched his knife, his knuckles white. "You aren't me," he whispered. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Then the scratching started again. But this time it was faster, more frantic. The tent began to shake as if something massive was trying to peel it open. Thomas scrambled to the back of the tent, watching as the silhouette of a tall, impossibly thin figure moved around the perimeter. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, snapping and clicking like breaking ice with every step. Thomas could see the creature's ribs pushing through its pale, translucent skin as it pressed against the tent walls. It was easily 9 feet tall, with a head that looked like a deer's skull wrapped in gray frozen parchment. The creature didn't have eyes. It had hollow pits of endless starving hunger that seemed to suck the light from his flashlight. It leaned in close, its face just inches away from the nylon, and let out a long, low whistle, a sound that vibrated in Thomas's very marrow. And then it spoke again. This time, it used the voice of Thomas's mother, who had been dead for 20 years. "Thomas, honey, it's so cold. Won't you let me in for a minute?" Thomas felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized he wasn't being hunted for food. He was being toyed with. This thing was a collector of voices, a mimic that lived in the frost. He knew he couldn't stay in the tent. He waited for a break in the scratching, then he burst out of the tent into the blinding whiteout of the blizzard. He didn't pack his gear. He didn't grab his boots. He ran in his thermal socks, his feet burning from the cold, his vision a blur of swirling snow. He felt the creature right behind him. He could hear its ragged, wet breathing echoing his own. Every time he stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. He saw pale, spindly shapes jumping through the trees in his peripheral vision, closing in on him. He reached his snowmobile, fumbling with the keys as the cold began to shut down his nervous system. Just as the engine roared to life, a long, skeletal hand slammed down on the seat behind him. Thomas pinned the throttle. He drove like a madman through the darkness, the wind screaming in his ears, feeling like the trees were shifting their positions to block his path. He didn't look back until he reached the cabin and barricaded the door. He sat there with a loaded shotgun until the sun finally rose over the horizon. Search and rescue teams later went to his campsite. They found the tent shredded, but not by claws. It looked as if it had been dismantled, piece by piece, with surgical precision. But the most unsettling part was the tracks. They found Thomas's footprints leading away, but right next to them were thousands of barefoot human footprints, all of them perfectly matching Thomas's own foot size, walking in a perfect, intricate spiral around the campsite. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing that follows you in the snow, doesn't just want your life. It wants to become you. It marks its prey and harvests their identity until there's nothing left but a shell of ice. But the real question is this. Thomas eventually recovered and moved to a city in the south, far away from the snow. But last night, he woke up to a sound at his window. He looked out into the pouring rain and saw a man standing on the sidewalk wearing Thomas's old surveying jacket. The man turned around, and Thomas saw his own face staring back at him, a face that didn't have any skin, just a frozen, lipless grin. Imagine you're tucked into your sleeping bag, the campfire is nothing but glowing embers, and your 6-year-old daughter is fast asleep just 3 feet away from you inside the tent. Then, from the pitch-black woods outside, you hear her voice. Not a scream, not a cry, but a soft, rhythmic giggle, followed by her saying, "Daddy, come look at the tall man." You look down, and your daughter is still right there, breathing deeply in her sleep. Your heart stops because you realize that whatever is outside just a thin layer of nylon away knows exactly how to sound like the person you love most in the world. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of hiking boots and fill them with fast-drying industrial cement right before they head out on a 20-mile trek into the wilderness. Before we get into today's story, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the summer of 2018, deep within the Black Hills of South Dakota. This is a place of rugged beauty, ancient granite peaks, and dense forests where the shadows seem a little longer than they should be. Our main character is a man named Mark. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman, a guy who had spent his whole life navigating the backcountry. He wasn't the type to get spooked by a snapping twig or a hooting owl. This trip was supposed to be special, a father-daughter camping weekend with his 6-year-old Lily. They found a secluded spot, far off the main trails, near a creek that whispered over smooth stones. The first day was perfect. They caught trout, explored rock formations, and Lily collected what she called magic stones. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a bruised, sickly purple, the forest went into what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every cricket, every rustle of wind simply ceased to exist. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine, a primal instinct screaming that they were being watched by something that didn't have a name. They retreated into the tent early. Lily fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from the day. Mark, however, lay wide awake, his hand gripping the handle of his hunting knife. Around 20 inches the morning, the silence was broken. It started as a faint rustle, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. Then he heard it. Lily's voice. "Daddy, I'm cold. Can you open the door?" The voice came from directly outside the tent flap. Mark's blood turned to ice. He looked down at Lily. She was dead to the world, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Mark sat bolt upright, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't say a word. He knew the rules of these woods. He grabbed his high-intensity flashlight and with a trembling hand flicked it on through the mesh window of the tent. The beam sliced through the darkness, hitting the tree line 20 feet away. There, standing between two massive pines, was a figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, impossibly thin, with skin the color of a drowned corpse. It didn't have a nose or ears, just two sunken, milky pits for eyes and a mouth that was stretched into a wide, lipless grin. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, swaying slightly like a branch in the wind. Then, without moving its mouth, Lily's voice came out of it again. "Daddy, why won't you let me in?" The voice was an exact match. It had the same lisp, the same pitch, the same innocence. But then, the pitch began to shift. It dropped an octave, then another, until it was a wet, guttural growl that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. The Lily voice turned into a distorted, repeating loop. In, let me in. Daddy, in. Mark grabbed Lily, pulling her small body against him, covering her mouth so she wouldn't wake up and scream. He watched as the creature began to move. It didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking wood. It circled the tent, its long claw-like fingers dragging across the nylon. The sound was like 1,000 needles scratching a chalkboard. Then, the creature stopped right in front of the tent door. Mark could see its silhouette through the fabric, a towering, skeletal shape that seemed to block out the stars. It leaned in close, its face pressed against the thin material. Mark could hear its breathing, a long, ragged, wet intake of air. And then, the creature whispered in Mark's own voice, using a sentence Mark had said to Lily just that afternoon. "Don't worry, honey. Daddy's got you. You're safe." Mark felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over him. He realized then that this thing wasn't just a predator, it was a collector of identities. It had been watching them all day, recording their voices, waiting for the moment they were most vulnerable. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The weight against the tent vanished. Mark sat there in the dark, frozen, until the first gray light of dawn broke through the trees. He didn't pack. He didn't look for his gear. He grabbed Lily, who was confused and crying, and he ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his feet bled, never looking back at the whistling woods. He reached his truck and drove until he hit a crowded diner 3 towns away. Search and rescue later found Mark's campsite. His tent was shredded from the inside out, but there were no signs of a struggle. What they did find, however, was a trail of Lily's magic stones leading deep into a cave system that hadn't been mapped. At the entrance of that cave, they found a small, handheld recorder that Mark had left behind. When they played it, there was no audio of Mark or Lily. There was only 30 minutes of a wet clicking sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator, saying, "We found them, they're right here." There is a theory on Reddit that the Black Hills are home to a fleshgate or a variation of the Wendigo, a creature that mimics those we trust to lure us into the dark. But the question remains, if Mark and Lily made it out that morning, why did Mark's wife call the police 2 nights ago, claiming that she woke up to find Mark and Lily standing in the backyard in the middle of a thunderstorm, staring at the house and whispering her name in a voice that sounded like static?